the subject that I wanted to talk about today is Seneca, Stoic philosopher, a particular text of his on the brevity of life. And you may have noticed in the talk itself, there's a subtitle on how to work with time. So the emphasis here is really looking at understanding what is time from a philosophical perspective and how can we work with it better. My objective here is not a lecture on time management, just to be clear. There are, I'm sure, many valid approaches to organizing ourselves better from a purely pragmatic standpoint, available online to help us structure our day and so on. But these tools, techniques that can help us can be limited. So what I'm interested in doing is exploring a little bit deeper than just the techniques. Any technique really requires a foundation, which for me is an understanding that goes beyond just the tools, the tricks, the tips. Because any structure without a foundation is going to be a bit shaky. And any technique that we may have without a deep understanding of what we're working with is going to lead to, let's say, somewhat inconsistent application. So to do that, then we're seeking to understand, I suppose, first, what is time, which in itself is a big question. Generally, we recognize time as an energy, but a very special kind of energy, very unique energy, which can neither be created or stored. It's simply used or not used. We also commonly understand time as having three phases: past, present, and future. But there's two other dimensions to time, which we're going to look at a little bit this afternoon: moment and duration. Philosopher Georgios Plana helps us to define these two aspects and their distinction with the following. Duration is related to the quantity of time necessary or available to carry out an action. Moment is related to the quality of time, which is greater or lesser in concordance with that action. Duration is the objective factor. Moment is a subjective, psychological, and therefore imponderable dimension. Okay, so this is quite an interesting, useful definition to help us understand a little bit why there is this elasticity to time, the way that we experience it, the way that things that we enjoy, things that we like, that we're enthusiastic about, can kind of capture us, and then suddenly the time is gone. Whereas, on the other hand, things that we find boring, we don't particularly like, which aggravate us, they can feel like they're dragging on forever. And yet, at the same time, as much as time may feel like it's, incrementally going very slowly, we still can feel, almost paradoxically, that time has gone very fast. And it's a comment that I hear often now over the last almost year with our current circumstances and the lockdown and so on. And indeed, I've experienced myself this kind of paradoxical, everything is dragging, and yet suddenly, holy crap, months have gone by. So there's clearly a perception in this relationship with time that we have that presents a very a kind of a fundamental contradiction. And in the midst of all this, we tend to be left feeling, ultimately, that we never have enough time. So understanding this dynamic helps us to understand how we experience it. That duration, as we're defining it, is the time that things take to happen. But the moment, as a concept, is our experience of that time. And so it really depends on our attitude to what we're doing, how we work with time, as to whether we will either experience only the duration, the horizontal length of how long something takes, or if we're able to tap into this concept of the moment, which gives us a slightly more elevated, perhaps more vertical experience. So that idea of moment is a greater depth, a greater engagement. We can say, in a way, perhaps there's a kind of a magical dimension to it. I don't know a better way to put it, because it's not logical. It's not a rational experience, but there's something transcendent in those moments where we feel almost outside of time. But I suppose we can commonly say that we experience duration more than moment, typically. So why is that? Why do we more feel this concept of time dragging, that we're fighting against the clock, that we're being oppressed by this sea of time all the time? Well, here we're going to turn to Seneca and some of the advice that he presents in the relationship that we have with time, this attitude that we can cultivate in our approach to how we work with time. And this text on the brevity of life is actually a series of letters that he wrote to a friend of his named Paulinus to address these very concerns. So I'm going to take a few extracts throughout the talk from his text, which will help us to understand his thoughts on this. And one of the earliest things that he says in the book gives a good summary of where he's coming from. He says, "We feel that life is short because time slips by in the blink of an eye. We can feel robbed, become bitter, or at least often have an undercurrent of low-level anxiety because we always feel that time is escaping us, that we are one step behind the clock." Quite clear, quite direct, which we'll see as the Stoics tend to be. But to me, what's fascinating here is that it's also incredibly pertinent. 2,000 years old, and yet this could be about any time for any person, really. And it speaks to the anxiety, the stress, the concerns that we often have because of this sense of not having enough time. So before we continue with unpacking what Seneca is advising, I'm going to go back a little bit to help us understand Seneca. We need to understand a little bit about Stoicism. And just by way of a brief introduction, because I think a lot of people are at least somewhat familiar with Stoicism these days. It's something that's quite interesting to observe over the last decade or so. Stoicism has made quite a resurgence in popular mainstream, well, I'm just going to say pop culture, but that's not quite right, in psychology, in self-help, in philosophy. And before that, I think there was often a misconception about Stoicism, perhaps it still remains in some cases, that Stoicism was somehow hard, cold, distant, unfeeling as a philosophy. That to be Stoic meant to have no emotions. And I think people are getting past that misconception, but it's easy to understand why that misconception arose, because what the Stoics are proposing is that we gain a little bit of mastery over our emotions and over our mind. And that discipline of self-mastery, self-restraint was misconstrued as a kind of a repression, that we hold our feelings in rather than express them. This does run contrary as a way of living to a lot of how we're presented in the world today as kind of the ideal of happiness. Because how does the world tell us to be today? What's the model that's presented to us? In general, there's a strong emphasis on feeling things intensely, to be passionate about life. If you're not passionate about everything that you do, you're not living at all. That's essentially a strong message that we're being told in the world today. But what the Stoics and many others warn us of is that, uninhibited passion, unchecked emotions lead to a lot of inner instability, that we become very attached to our desires, to our passions, and subject to their whims. So we lose a lot of our own personal freedom because we become possessed, in a way, by our own emotional intensity. So rather than repressing our emotions, mastering them or educating them so that we gain a level of that self-mastery helps us to have an inner stability, a verticality, which allows us to develop inner resilience, which is different from being hard, as is sometimes misunderstood. Resilience gives us the inner strength, the moral character to be able to face with serenity the natural adversities of life. Not a bad proposition. So Stoicism is suggesting that the concept of Stoicism coming from the word stoa. The stoas were the Greek columns or colonnades of ancient Greek architecture. So the image is that of verticality, of uprightness, of stability. So that's giving us a sense of what Stoicism is implying, working towards. And with that, there's a great sense of a kind of a no-nonsense approach to things. And that's what we see, which is very refreshing in Stoic writings. And Seneca is a good example. It's very direct, perhaps even blunt at times. But that kind of sobering directness helps us to cut through a lot of the waffle of our opinions, of our preferences, and to see things a little bit more in the cold light of day. So if we're to turn then to Seneca as a good example of the Stoic philosophy, Lucius Seneca was born sometime around the year 1 BC in Cordoba in Spain. The texts that we have from his writings, essays and letters that he wrote over his life, over the course of his life, all give incredible insights into the human condition. Like the other Stoics and famous Stoics of Rome, Seneca, also kind of bucked this assumption or misunderstanding of Stoics being, resigned from life, that they're passive. He was very active in his city, in his country. He was a successful playwright of the time. He was quite financially wealthy. He was a successful investment banker, kind of, or the equivalent of the time, which is also an interesting twist on the assumptions that we sometimes have that Stoics or philosophers shouldn't be materialistic in any way, and that they aren't able to involve themselves in pragmatic pursuits. But he was able to have a successful career without being overwhelmed or consumed by it. As well as this, he was also very involved in government. He was an advisor of the government of the time, a senator for a period, eventually becoming an advisor to the Emperor Nero. And if you know Roman history at all, Nero was, I think the technical term is nuts. He was a crazy person who went a bit despotic in his role as emperor. There was a lot of paranoia. There was a lot of conspiracies. Seneca got swept up in all of these things, though he tried to extract himself from it. He retired from political life. Ultimately, Nero, under his paranoia and suspicion, ordered that Seneca take his own life, which Seneca did. That was the Roman way. If the emperor demanded your life, you would give it up with dignity, integrity. It's a different time, so it's hard for us to understand that mindset now, but that was ultimately his end. Seneca, at the age of 65, emulating Socrates in the way that he was put to death, he drank hemlock poison. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to Seneca. And to reframe then how we're looking at the concept of time, we're looking at the idea of moment and duration. And ultimately what Seneca is proposing is that the issue isn't that we don't have time, it's fundamentally about how we use the time. Or as he says in the book, the problem is not that we have a short life, but that we waste time. So again, a little bit more direct. So what we're looking at then is not only how to organize ourselves, but what are we using the time for? Because we can be very organized, we can be very productive in doing certain things, but they're not always necessarily useful. And it's a deeper reflection then to understand how we're spending our time and how it serves us and others. This suggests then that time management is not really a question of organization, rather, as Seneca would put it, it's a moral question. When we prioritize our time, what are we prioritizing? Are we prioritizing making money or being happy? Prioritizing reaching others' expectations or being true to ourselves? Are we prioritizing comfort or challenging ourselves to be better people? This may sound simplistic. It's not simple. It requires a reflection and an understanding of what our priorities are. But this is a big part of understanding how to work with time. Because this sense of moment, which is to say that it's more than just duration, it comes from a sense of value in the time spent, what we can call quality time. But maybe not, quality time as we currently define it, because quality time today tends to be downtime, doing as little as possible, or only doing what we like, maybe. Of course, we can like what we're doing and it can still have meaning, but preferences are relative when it comes to acting with purpose. What I mean by this is if we only wait to do things that we like, then we're not always going to do that much. Or what we do is going to have a very narrow scope because it'll only adhere to our preferences. When we get into that mindset, then we think that, I'm saving my time for the things that I like. And we try to store the time. But of course, as we defined earlier, time is not something that we can store. So we think that we're saving time to do things, but then we never have the time to do those things. We get increasingly anxious about having more time to do the things that we like. And anything that is outside of that is perceived as a disturbance. It's coming to rob my time, to take my time, to prevent me from doing the things that I like. So in reality, then, the question is, what is so important that we spend all our time on it and still never have enough time for it? What Seneca does in the Brevity of Life is he presents two models. He calls the busy man and the man of leisure. Both, as he describes them, are actually doing neither. The busy man is not busy, and the leisured man is not relaxed. They're both simply preoccupied and, as such, squandering a lot of valuable time. This is what Seneca writes in the book of the busy man. A so-called busy man may declare the day to be endless, or may mourn how the hours crawl slowly toward dinner time. But this is no evidence that this man's life is long. For when the busy man finally has some time to himself, he's left to stew in boundless boredom with nothing to do and with no clue how to fill his day. Ironically, the pleasures of these men are usually plagued by distractions and concerns as to how long the pleasurable feeling will last. Why is such happiness tinged with fear? because the superficial joy of people is not based on something real, but on something as troubled and fleeting as the life they were born into. A pleasure that is ephemeral brings no true satisfaction to any man. How miserable must be the lives of those folks who labor so hard for something that once gained they must work even harder to keep. They toil night and day to get what they want and worry a great deal about what they have. Meantime, no one realizes how many days have slipped by never to return. Something new always comes along to keep the occupied busy. Hope begets hope, ambition more ambition. Okay, now, just to be clear, ambition is not the problem. Ambition per se is not negative. The question again is, what are we ambitious for? If it's the pursuit of recognition, glory, validation, money, status, power, then it's what we can call material ambition. But there's another ambition, there's spiritual ambition. Spiritual not in the sense of perhaps the religious understanding, spiritual in the sense of developing that which is best in us. That connection inside that is highest, most noble, most altruistic, i.e. to be the best that we can be. So where is our ambition for that, to drive ourselves to be a better person? Perhaps we can say a moral or ethical ambition, to be more whole, more complete individuals. That's really what Seneca is proposing. That led by a moral impetus, we're calmer, less stressed, less influenced by external pressures, including time. Morality here, we're not talking about anything moralistic. It's not a superiority. It's not a judgment on anyone else. It's simply a development of our own, as I mentioned earlier, moral character, our own inner strength, so that we can act more morally or ethically, if you prefer. And by ethical, we mean that the way that we act is consistent, coherent, as an expression of who we are. When we are busy, like the busy man of Seneca, we seek comfort, escapism, distractions to defuse or depressure ourselves from that intensity. So that often manifests itself in a lot of R&R, a lot of rest and relaxation, or at least the pursuit of it, and often an anxiety in the pursuit of it. Now, there's nothing that says that rest is bad, just to be absolutely clear. We need to rest. But the question is, what kind of rest? What brings us rest, as in what regenerates us? Because ideally, rest should regenerate, rejuvenate, so that we replenish our energy so that we can continue. But do all the forms of rest we engage in do that? Do we end up feeling more tired? And that's also how we can perceive, or we can understand a little bit the model that's being presented to us in general by the world. That, you know, the only happy life is a leisurely one. I'm being kind of synthetic here, but you know, the goal is ultimately to win the lotto and live on the beach. Never have to do anything again. I mean, we live in a culture that promotes idleness in many ways. This whole celebrity obsession, which has become the reality TV celebrity obsession, where people are idolized for no reason that I can understand. They're literally famous for doing nothing. And that's become a model that people are aspiring to, because we've been told that that's happiness. But what Seneca says of the leisured man is quite interesting. He says, even the leisured man is busy, in his mansion or on his couch, alone, withdrawn from the world, where the only source of worry is himself. Truly, such people are not living in leisure, but are busy being idle. They have no leisure. They are too busy doing nothing. Such a man is thus not at leisure, and a different term is required. Like a patient who has passed on, he has ceased to live, but is unaware that he is dead. A man who is half alive, how can he be the master of his time? Again, strong words from Seneca, but it's an interesting reflection for ourselves in these moments of leisure, when we partake in them, when we indulge in them. How much are we relaxing and how much are we just busy doing nothing? And I'm sure we all know from our own experiences, extended periods of doing nothing is actually kind of exhausting. The whole Netflix binge is a popular pursuit and can be seen as a great way to spend some time. And I'm not knocking Netflix, I enjoy it myself, but you know, if you watch an entire series in one sitting, you're a zombie at the end of it. So what else can we do to rest? What else can we do to regenerate ourselves? It's a perception issue, because rest is not only doing nothing. There can be activities that regenerate us, and that's a form of rest. We have the expression, a change is as good as a rest. There's a lot of wisdom in that idea. To help us understand that a little bit further, we can also look to the East, just to deviate for a minute from Seneca, because we're looking at two extremes, the busy man, the leisured man, two extremes of behavior, which we all tend to fluctuate between. Naturally, we may express one more than the other, depending on our own temperament, but in general, we tend to circulate between activity and passivity. And in the East, in Hindu traditions, they talk about these different behaviors. On the one hand, rajas, action, activity. On the other hand, tamas, passivity, passive action. And the aspiration is the balance in between, sattva. So I have a little crude image here that can kind of illustrate this, which I'll explain. Tamas we have here, that's passivity. Rajas, excess activity. And then sattva is what we're trying to develop. Harmonious, balanced action. Because what happens is we tend to cycle, wildly cycle between the two. We go from one extreme to the other. What we're seeking is a rhythm of action which is balanced, which is more vertical, which is sattva, they call. So rhythm is the key, really, to moderating activity. And we could say working with time as an energy. Rhythm proposes a harmonious activity. Rhythm isn't constant action. We think that if I don't take breaks, then I'm going to be going forever, and that's impossible. Of course, it's impossible. We need to rest, but these rests are like punctuations that help us to continue. In the same way that music is the combination of sound and silence. If it was just uninterrupted sound, it would be noise. So further to be rhythm, further to be harmony, there has to be a balance between activity and rest. And this concept of rhythm we can observe, well, all around us in nature, but especially in the human being, we can see these functions of rhythm. When we breathe, in the beating of the heart, there's a constant rhythm. Do these ever stop? Well, yes, when we die. So rhythm is essential to life. Of course, there's a rhythm that brings a period of rest within that movement, but at the same time, it's a constant movement. Nothing in nature really ever stops. Everything is constantly in activity. The way that we tend to operate is more kind of extreme in how it's very stop-start. We expend a huge amount of energy to do things, and then we collapse at the end. Huge amount of energy and collapse at the end. And that then requires even more energy to get started again, because we have to build up momentum all over again. And with that, the prospect of activity always seems like a burden. It's painful. It's going to be difficult, because we don't tend to use our resources of energy very well, and we don't tend to regenerate ourselves very well. Some simple examples, perhaps, to help, because we can incorporate this in practical ways. If we're physically very tired, we can regenerate ourselves mentally and emotionally through reading inspirational texts or listening to beautiful music. Using the mind positively, even while the body is tired, is very regenerating. And conversely, when the mind is exhausted for whatever reason, physical activity is a good approach to do some exercise or even cleaning. I'm not kidding, to just clean things physically while we're exhausted or maybe in a bad mood. It's a good use of our time to focus on something else that helps to re-energize us. Otherwise, the tendency is to fluctuate between adrenaline junkie and couch potato. We go from one extreme to the other. And whichever one we occupy, we're thinking about the other. So in activity, I'm anxious for rest. In rest, I'm anxious for activity. So we don't even enjoy what we're doing. Activity doesn't satisfy us. Rest doesn't re-energize us. And therefore, we feel that we never have time. It's not that we don't have time, simply that we're not getting use out of the time with this approach. And it often boils down also to the misunderstanding we have about quantity and quality. We think that, okay, to maximize my time, I have to do more. The more I do, the better I do. But that's the quantity approach, whereas if we invert that, the better I do, the more I can do. If I do what I do with quality, with more presence, attention, generosity, determination, then already what I'm doing, I can do more of it. How many times do we do things, trying to do a lot of things, we rush, we don't do them well, we have to redo them. And so then we lose time because we have to do it again, and we get frustrated and flustered. And if we just focus to do things well once, then we free up time to do the next thing. So this is also an approach that is largely contrary to how we've been told to behave, that quality is more important than quantity. How do we qualify our actions then so that we bring quality to what we're doing? Seneca offers some advice on that. He says, the present offers one day at a time, divided into minutes, but all the days of the past can be conjured up when called and are under your control to behold them at will. A trick that the busy have no time to perform. What he's saying in simple terms is the importance of taking the time to reflect, to take stock, to extract lessons from experiences. Being in the moment and being present is important, but if we can do that, it's so that we can observe what's happening and learn from our actions, our victories and our mistakes, so that we can bring another dimension of quality to what we're doing. If we're too busy all the time to reflect on anything, to think about anything, then we're just rushing into action. And it's difficult to go beyond the surface then of our experiences. To help with this, he also says, a clear conscience gives the tranquil mind power to explore all the parts of its existence. But the mind that is preoccupied, as if burdened by a yoke, cannot turn and look back. So in using our time, we have to also give ourselves time. We have to take time to reflect, to ask questions of ourselves, to observe ourselves. Our tendency is to rush through things, to get it done. Out of anxiety, out of the desire for comfort. But what Seneca is describing here is a clearer perspective. And to gain perspective, we need to gain a little bit of distance. And for that, to gain a little bit of distance, it's important to lessen the emphasis on quantity and look more at quality. In qualifying our actions, we can also say that we're acting with quality or qualities. So to bring meaning to what we do, we have to work with our qualities, our human qualities, which are many. There's a long list: courage, patience, determination, generosity. There are many, and we all have at least some. We may sometimes feel like we don't have any, but no human is devoid of any qualities. The question is, which ones do we have? Because we don't all have the same ones. Some may be slightly rusty. We don't use it very often. Some are more innate. We've developed them well, but we're not even conscious that we have them. So we use them perhaps a little mechanically. But to use them consciously means to act from the best in us. And through that, we bring a depth of quality to what we're doing, which helps to give the time that we spend meaning and purpose. Another quick illustration to help. And some are familiar with this, I think, already from some of our classes. This is a model attributed to Western philosophy of the human being that divides the human being into three planes or dimensions, which are soma, the physical, psyche, the emotional body and the ego, nous, then, which is the spirit or intelligence, the timeless, universal aspect of the human being. So Western philosophies like the Stoics talk about these three aspects of the human experience, and that our perspective comes from where we place ourselves. Where do we place our sense of self or our identity? Is it in soma? Is it in the physical body, in our appearance, in our possessions? Is it in psyche, our mood, our opinions, our perceptions? Or is it in nous, that aspect that is highest in us, our dreams, our values, our aspirations? So what they advise when it comes to the idea of ethics or behavior is that our actions should be a reflection of our values, our identity. And if I place my identity solely in the physical body, then I'll act accordingly. And we can notice this because it happens often. We're a bit hungry, or we stub our toe, or we're sick, and physically our reality consumes us. We act totally in accordance with how we feel physically. Or emotionally, if I'm in a mood, if someone insulted me, I take it personally, I'm stewing in that, then I act accordingly. I'm not necessarily pleasant to be around. So we act in the way that we identify with ourselves. And naturally, this is going to fluctuate too, because we're not going to be able to stay in any one sphere of consciousness indefinitely. But the objective, philosophically, is that we invert that a little bit more so that we're identifying with what is highest in us. That we place the I am in our values, our dreams, our deepest sense of who we are. This is the plane of ideas, the plane of our deepest sense of self that allows us to overcome. Plato called it the individual, and the rest is the personality. This is our vehicle of expression. It's like a car that is taking our timeless self through this experience in life. So do we identify as the car or the driver? If we only remain on the surface of our identification, of our experiences, then naturally what we will experience when it comes to time is the duration. It will be difficult for us to penetrate a deeper understanding of time. So this is why Seneca presents time as a moral question. Not only how we organize ourselves, but how we choose to spend our time. So it's a question for us to reflect on. Do we use our time to better ourselves, to do the things that make us happy in the deep sense of the word? Or is it simply to fulfill our pleasures, to avoid stress? Like the busy man or the leisured man, do we occupy ourselves with projects that lead nowhere? Or do we struggle to, as much as possible, do nothing? And that's a very interesting reflection for all of us to take, to gain that distance perspective that Seneca is talking about so that we can ask ourselves that question. And what's important in any of these kind of philosophical reflections is to look at ourselves honestly, but without judgment. There's no usefulness in berating ourselves or flagellating ourselves that we should be doing things differently. If we can observe it, then good, we can correct it. But that question is something that no one can do for you. Everyone has to look at that, reflect on it for themselves and by themselves to understand, how do I use my time in relation to what's important to me? So an exercise, let's call it homework if you like, something that you can do if you want to explore this relationship with time in your own life a little bit. Take some time to think about it, and you can set down on paper 5 things that you want to spend more time on, or that you think you should be spending more time on, but that you never have enough time for. And then also 5 things that you can say that you spend too much time on, or that you feel are a waste of your time. So 5 things that you want to spend more time on, 5 things that you think you're spending too much time on. Then you can go through the list and reflect on each item, how it corresponds to you. The real you, your values, that which you place as being most important. Some are going to be obvious, some not so obvious. So it takes a process of reflection. But if we do this, we can start to see emerging a hierarchy of priorities, so that you start to observe the list of things that matter and the list that don't matter so much. How much time do you spend on each? And from that, you can start to correct. From that, I'm sure there's loads of ways that you can organize yourself differently and different techniques that can help. But beyond the science of time management, there's an art, which is fundamentally an ethical art of understanding those priorities. What drives us? How can we develop a better rhythm of action in accordance with those priorities? Okay? Enjoy the reflection. It's a very interesting exercise. What you do with that after that is up to you completely, but at least it's an opportunity to look at how we use our time. I'm just about out of time, so just to conclude with something from Seneca, which kind of wraps up his overall emphasis, which I think, to translate a little bit the first line, because it's a little poetic, but what he's saying is that we can rest in life, but only when we liberate ourselves from our attachment to rest. One of those classical philosophical paradoxes. The more we seek comfort and rest, the more anxious we are, the less we actually rest. But what he says, nature permits us respite only when we are free from the desires of the flesh. It is a truth that sustains us and is a serious principle of the heart of all existence. It lifts our life beyond the confines of earthly concerns and exalts our nature to the stars. Is this not a miracle? One has to leave the ground in order to see the whole world.